Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Secretary Forum, Resident Coordinator for Micronesian, distinguished delegates, colleagues and friends. Bulavanaka, and a warm welcome to all speakers, moderators and participants who are joining either in person or online to this, the second UN Pacific Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights, organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Pacific Regional Office, and the Working Group on Business and Human Rights in collaboration with partnering organizations. My name is Robert Vaughan, Focal Point for Business and Human Rights in the OHCHR Pacific Office, and I'll be your Master of Ceremony for the next 2 days of what we hope will be an exciting forum for all participating. Over the next 2 days, we will have 8 sessions focusing on human rights issues that are highly relevant to the Oceania region, with an ultimate aim to increase knowledge, build capacity of those working in the business and human rights space, and creating partnerships for businesses, governments, and civil society, so that we can all work towards the advancement of the protection and promotion of human rights and build societies where business creates positive change. I'm happy to announce that we have over 400 registered participants from all corners of the globe. And I would like now to introduce OHCHR's regional representative of the Pacific, Ms. Heike Alefsen. Heike has over 30 years of human rights, legal, political, and development work experience with the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and civil society. She has served in human rights functions in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific for the past decade, previously with OHCHR in Geneva, with the UN Division Advancement of Women and UNIFEM in New York, as the Council of Europe representative in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and with Amnesty International's International Secretariat. Heike, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Robert, and Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, partners, colleagues, and friends. Nisam Bulavanaka from Suva and Fiji. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this second UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. This event builds upon last year's first ever forum, and it provides the perfect opportunity to take stock of what areas of the business and human rights agenda have been advanced in our region and where we still have work to do. First of all, let me express special thanks to our co-organizers, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, represented here today in our high-level opening panel by Mr. Surya, Deva, the chair of the group. And I'm very thrilled by the interest in this forum. As we've heard, over 400 registered participants. We hope for more. And I'd like to welcome our high-level speakers, as well as those who will join the debates and the sessions and the deliberations online and in the national hubs that we have created around the Pacific. We currently have 3 of these hubs, with participants joining in Fiji, in the Solomon Islands, and in Vanuatu. And we're very pleased that it was able to organize these types of hubs, because we believe that this will enhance our exchange and discussion. Dear participants, this year we marked the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, this year in June. Their unanimous endorsement by the United Nations Human Rights Council was a landmark moment for efforts to promote respect for human rights and sustainable business. This 10-year anniversary is therefore an important milestone. And it is only fitting that we perhaps take a moment right now to pay tribute to Professor John Ruggy, whose drive and commitment as the first special representative of the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights was central to the development of the guiding principles, and who sadly passed away in September at the age of 76. Throughout his engagement, he was involved with lots of different stakeholders from all walks of life, researching and advocating for new ways of thinking and working to prevent and mitigate human rights risks related to business. The UN Guiding Principles were his response to building a more sustainable world and the blueprint for how things should and could be. There is much at stake in the global current environment for the future that we all want. Action is required on the climate and environmental crises, combined with other major global challenges, such as shrinking civic space, populism, corruption, conflict, and other fragilities, and the as yet unknown human consequences of technological developments. The socioeconomic crisis that has resulted from COVID-19 has further laid bare and amplified gross existing inequalities and injustices, including pervasive gender and racial discrimination. In the Pacific, we stand at a crossroads in terms of how we build back better, or some would say forward, for the global COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit our economies, our societies, families, and individuals so hard. It can only be done by protecting people's lives and protecting their livelihoods. Whilst governments grapple with the continuing health emergency, we must equally deal with the economic and social effects, as the intersection of these impacts can cause further discrimination against individuals and groups. It is only through taking a human rights-based approach that involves everyone to participate in open, transparent, and accountable responses that we will solve these issues. Responsible business must therefore be at the core of the responses to these challenges. The UN Guiding Principles' 3 pillars tell us what is needed in practice. States must protect human rights, businesses should respect human rights, and victims need access to effective remedies to guarantee their rights. Working with the private sector, with businesses, will therefore be a priority for any state, as global threats require a global response. The crisis has revealed weaknesses that human rights can help to fix, to protect people, ecosystems, biodiversity, and the natural world. Dear partners, the Pacific region continues to experience significant challenges in addressing human rights impacts of business activities on individuals and communities across the whole region, across Oceania. It remains the only region in the world where no state has yet developed a national action plan on business and human rights. So it is our hope that this regional forum will further advance this goal, and we will soon see a Pacific government committed to produce a national action plan in a collaborative manner based on the principles of inclusion of all voices. Our office, the UN Human Rights Regional Office, stands ready to support any country that makes this commitment to develop a national action plan. Secondly, there must also be continued work with the human rights defenders community. Alongside the diplomacy training program, the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, PIANGO, the Citizens Constitutional Forum, and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, our regional office has continued to raise awareness of the business and human rights agenda and the UN Guiding Principles throughout our annual flagship training program, which has over the past 3 years that it's been running, built the capacities of over 180 human rights defenders. We will continue this work, hopefully jointly with other agencies, and we will also be looking at other developments such as modern-day slavery legislation and mandatory human rights due diligence in the context of supply chains and business practices. Over the next 2 days, as my colleague has said, we will see panel discussions on a myriad of topics, such as land and territorial issues, climate change, environment, and reaching net zero, the role of national human rights institutions, mandatory human rights due diligence, the role of human rights defenders, access to remedies, extractive industries, diversity, gender and inclusion, labor, decent work, and modern-day slavery, banking, and Pacific financial inclusion, and new technologies, the digital space, and artificial intelligence. So this is a whole range of issues that the business and human rights agenda covers. And many more could be added if we had the space and the time and the resources. That's perhaps for a third forum. And I think you will agree that we will have an exciting lineup, and we hope for innovative discussions. I'm delighted to see that I'm joined in this high-level forum by the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Mr. Philemon Manoni, by the Resident Coordinator for Micronesia, Mr. Jaap van Hierden, by obviously Mr. Surya Deva, whom I've already introduced, the chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Mr. Kameli Bhattiwetti, Chief Executive Officer of Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation, representing the business community, and Ms. Emeline Ilolahia, Executive Director of PIANGO, representing civil society. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the government of Sweden for their political and financial support for the Pacific Business and Human Rights Forum. We rely, of course, on the support of proactive human rights supporting governments, without whom we cannot do this important work. I encourage all of us to use this opportunity to both enhance our capacities in this forum, but also please to get involved as much as possible in these sessions. They really should be interactive. I know the experts are all looking forward to this and to talking with you rather than talking at you. So with these words, I thank you once again. I hope I've spoken slowly enough for the interpreter. I'm very grateful to the sign language interpreter. It's difficult for me to speak slowly, but now I hand over the floor to Mr. Surya Deva, member of the working group and the chair of the working group of Business and Human Rights, for his intervention. He has been with the working group for almost 6 years. He is a professor at Macquarie Law School at the University of Macquarie in Sydney, has been researching in the area of business and human rights, is a published author on business and human rights matters. He previously taught at the City University of Hong Kong, University of Delhi, and the National Law Institute, University of Bhopal. And he has been instrumental as one of the founding editors-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal, and sits on the advisory board of the Netherlands Quarterly of Human Rights, the Bennett Journal of International Constitutional Law, and the Indian Law Review and Australian Journal of Human Rights. He is also an elected member of the Executive Committee of the International Association on Constitutional Law. So with this, Surya, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Heike. Your Excellency, Dr. Philemon Manoni, distinguished panelist, I hope you can hear me. And ladies and gentlemen, this is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights. On behalf of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to this hybrid event. The COVID crisis has definitely created an opportunity for us. And I think this forum and the forum last year that we had is a concrete example of this, because we are using technology to our advantage to connect people both in person as well as virtually remotely from different parts of the world. This shows that we can adapt and show resilience and work together to overcome challenges. So crisis as an opportunity is something we can learn as a lesson here. But we can also learn a lesson from this crisis that there are many governance challenges, whether this is about poverty, inequality, conflicts, or climate change. We need to overcome these challenges as well in this innovative manner. I would like to mention that this forum is part of the regional approach of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. We believe that the local context matters. And with this goal in mind, we started this regional forum last year in the Pacific part of the world, because the working group felt that this part of the world is often left behind in the discourses around business and human rights. So I'm very grateful for the collaboration with the Office of the High Commissioner for the Human Rights for the Pacific and the support provided by the leadership of Heike in working with us to do this event. And this is the second year we are doing this event. In my remarks, I would like to talk about two aspects: where we are and where we should be going, in my view. Let me start with where we are, and I would like to highlight the progress that we have achieved in the last 10 years, the challenges that are with us despite those progresses that we have made, and finally, where we should be going. Let me start with the progress that we have made. The working group in June this year released a report about the progress we have made in terms of the implementation of UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is called the Stock Technical Report. And later this month at the UN Forum next week, we will be issuing a report about the roadmap, where we would like people to be going and the governments and companies to be doing going forward. I will put a link to that website in the chat box later on, and hopefully participants could read those reports when they get time. But let me come to the key highlights in terms of the progress that we have made. I think the UN Guiding Principles have been established as providing a common language. So all the stakeholders, whether these are the governments, businesses, civil society organizations, academia, lawyers, UN agencies, all of us are talking about this protect, respect, and remedy framework. This provides a pathway to create an inclusive and sustainable society. Moreover, what is very impressive about the UN Guiding Principles is that even if they are primarily focusing on states and companies, the uptake has been quite wide and extensive. We have industry associations, trade unions, sports organizations, universities, and other actors, including investors, using the UN Guiding Principles into their work and aligning their practices and policies to implement the UN Guiding Principles. The third aspect that I would like to highlight is the alignment. We have other international standards like the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the ILO tripartite declaration for multinational enterprises, and other standards. So these standards at the international level have been aligned with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, this is quite critical because that provides both governments and companies a common framework instead of they have to follow multiple different initiatives. The fourth and the final aspect of progress that I would like to highlight is that the UN Guiding Principles are also shaping laws and policies in different parts of the world. And the national action plans are being adopted. That is something which was mentioned by the previous panelist, is another example of that. But we also have increasingly mandatory human rights due diligence laws coming out, especially in Europe. In this part of the world, we have the Australian government enacting the modern slavery legislation. And we very much hope that as part of the review process next year, the Australian government will show leadership and make this law more comprehensive, more effective, but also go beyond modern slavery and move about wider business and human rights issues. Despite these signs of progress, I think there are continuing challenges in this part of the world as well as elsewhere. And I would again like to highlight 4 aspects of those challenges. First of all, the working group finds that there is a significant gap in the commitments that the governments and companies are making on paper and their practices. It is easy to say things, but it is more difficult to do those things. So I think going forward, it is absolutely vital that we continue to push both the governments and companies to talk the walk. To walk the talk. The second challenge that I would like to highlight is that it seems that the governments still continue to put economic development first before respect for human rights or environmental rights or dealing with climate change for that matter. Many companies still put profit first. So I think we need to bring this mindset and cultural shift in the thinking of both governments and companies that inclusive and sustainable development is only possible when they do profit with principles. And the principles are the human rights principles. The respect for human rights must be non-negotiable starting point. The third challenge that I would like to highlight is access to remedy and corporate accountability. I think despite all the progresses that we have made, the affected individuals and communities all over the world, including in the Pacific region, are struggling to hold businesses accountable. And I think in the next decade, much more needs to be done to ensure that. The fourth and the final challenge that I would like to highlight is shrinking civic space. As Heike highlighted, and the working group believes, and we issued some guidance on that, the role of civil society organizations and human rights defenders is absolutely vital. If they do not have that space to work with the governments and businesses, it will not really be possible to make progress in implementing UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And we see some regressive signs in this part of the world as well as throughout the globe. And I think this must be stopped. And the human rights defenders and civil society organizations, they must be seen as collaborators and critical friends in this particular process. Now, let me finally move to what we need to do going forward. And again, I will quickly highlight 4 aspects for our consideration. And hopefully this forum provides an opportunity to discuss some of these aspects. The first is that perhaps we need to develop a regional strategy for the Pacific region, for the Oceania. And I'm very glad that the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat is with us. And I very much hope that the PIF Pacific Islands Forum could take leadership on this and develop a regional strategy on business and human rights and connects it with Sustainable Development Goals agenda as well as the climate crisis, which is going to have disproportionate impact in the Pacific region. The second is we also need to develop national action plans. Heike already highlighted it. The third issue I'd like to highlight is that raising awareness and building capacity is very vital in this region. More needs to be done. We have been working and doing some workshops to build capacity, but hopefully that work will continue. And finally, we need to strengthen access to remedy. The role of civil society organizations and human rights defenders is absolutely critical, because without their support, we cannot really push this agenda forward. In conclusion, I think it would be appropriate for me to thank the key people who have pulled this forum together. Under the leadership of Heike, I think two people who have really worked very hard, almost 24 hours, are Robert Vaughan and Hierden. And I would like to acknowledge their hard work in pulling this forum together, despite all the challenges. So I wish the forum a huge success, and I look forward to participating in different sessions. Thank you very much once again, and back to you, Heike.
Thank you very much, Surya, for these opening remarks, very important insights. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Philemon Manoni, who was appointed Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in May 2020. Prior to that, he held the position of International Legal Advisor at the Forum Secretariat from 2018. And he's also held national level positions. He has in fact served as the Attorney General for the government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Prior to that function, he served as a legal advisor at the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency. It is my great pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Manoni.
Thank you, Moderator, and good morning, Bulavinaka, Kia orana from the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in Suva, Fiji. Like the previous speaker, I also wanted to thank the people who worked very hard to put this event together and to allow this discussion to happen. But distinguished speakers and participants, it does give me a great pleasure to be on this panel and to be part of this segment at the second Business Forum on Human Rights. At the time where there is so much uncertainty and despair, particularly for the business community, it is a good time for us to reflect. It is a timely reminder that fundamentally, irrespective of crisis and misadventures, human rights principles remain our moral compass. And this should remind us of our humanity and the glimmer of hope and light, which, if shown well, should take us all on an inclusive and embracing road to recovery. I also would like to take this opportunity to share some views about some of the Pacific Islands Forum priorities and how they intersect with business and the issue of human rights. As I understand it, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights provide the global framework for the respective duties and responsibilities of governments and businesses to take the necessary steps to prevent, mitigate, and to address business-related human rights abuses. They also offer a blueprint for how business respect for human rights can support the implementation of sustainable development goals and in line with international human rights standards. This complements our very own efforts here in the region through the development of the 2050 Pacific strategy for our Blue Pacific continent. This strategy represents the region's ongoing commitment to work together to develop long-term and regional approaches to critical challenges such as climate change, sustainable development, and security. It builds upon our shared stewardship of the Pacific Ocean and the interconnectedness of our environment, our cultures, and livelihoods. In delivering on these 2050 strategies, some key steps to date have included the development of a long-term vision for the region, identifying the most significant drivers of change impacting the future of the region, identifying regional and collective actions such as economic integration, governance, and human rights to respond to our drivers of change. We also undertook the development of themes and levels of ambition that represent where we want to go as a region by 2050. But to ensure that the strategy is seen as inclusive, people-centered, and pragmatic, it is important to establish a set of principles of accountability to the regionalism that commits members to the successful implementation of this strategy as a goal. So these principles include commitment at both national and regional levels in meeting the global human rights and other international legal obligations, recognizes the rights of all peoples, protects our natural environment, and ensures that no one is left behind. The Leaders' Boer Declaration on Regional Security is a clear example of where the region has asserted its security narrative, reflecting the self-determination principle and the broader notion of human rights, human development, and security. Against this background, there is no doubt a need for careful consideration to ensure that the most appropriate regional governance and institutional structures are in place that are able to promote, govern, and deepen collective responsibility and accountability to deliver on this 2050 strategy. But intersecting all of the above are some issues that confront us today, such as the COVID-19 and the pathway to recovery, the climate change issue, and the review of the Pacific Leaders' Gender Equality Declaration for more equitable and equal Blue Pacific. The COVID-19 crisis has no doubt exposed and exacerbated the existing human rights violations and inequalities globally, with a devastating effect on vulnerable groups and societies. For us in the Pacific, we saw this glaringly as borders closed and tourism-dependent economies suffered in the aftermath. Tourism-dependent economies like Cook Islands, Fiji, and others, where the shutdown of international travel had vastly affected GDP. According to the Asian Development Bank, decline is expected to continue by some 15.4% for year-end 2021. This impacts employment, household incomes, and particularly for women who hold about 60.5% of the tourism-related jobs. We look around us and we can see the damaging effect that the pandemic has had on people's living standards. Added to these issues of accessibility to vaccines for developing nations like ours in the region, sincere acknowledgement, though, to our partners for their ability and the kindness in coming to our aid on this angle, which is now enabling economies like Fiji attaining 90% vaccination rates and opening borders. The pre-pandemic, that several of our economies were still recovering from a series of natural disasters, 2019 and in 2020. Mother Nature reminding us the impacts of climate change are truly here. For small island developing states like us in the Pacific, who are vulnerable to the effects of climate change due to our reliance on the oceans for our resources, transportations, and livelihoods. We understand shifts in biodiversity due to climate change will at one day have devastating impact on coastal and island communities. For atoll nations, rising ocean threatens their existence, and we need to work together and defend our vulnerable communities to avoid loss of homes, loss of livelihood. In this context, the climate change has had a profound impact on a wide variety of human rights issues, including the rights to life, to self-determination, inclusivity, development, food security, health, water, sanitation, and housing, while further disproportionately affecting those who are already marginalized. The 2050 strategy that we are developing is very much guided by this biggest challenge before us. But lastly, in relation to gender and human rights and how this is crucial interface in business, women around the world are increasingly participating in the labor force, and businesses are recognizing that gender diversity in their workforce is necessary for competitive business performance. The Leaders' Gender Declaration was adopted at the 43rd Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting in 2012. While there has been some good progress, much more remains to be done to progress gender equality in the region. As an example, the Asian Development Bank Private Sector Development Initiative Leadership Matters, benchmarking women's business leadership in the Pacific report, was launched in September this year. It examines leadership and showed that Pacific also compares favorably with global averages. In the region, on average, women hold 21% of board seats, 11% of board chair positions, 19% of deputy board chair roles. In senior management, women comprise 13% of CEO positions and 34% of chief financial officers or chief operating officer positions. 27% of all Pacific boards have more than 30% women directors. And of those, 11% have at least equal numbers of men and women directors. However, more than 30% of all boards in the sample have no women directors, and a further 41% have fewer than 30% of women directors. So a forum like this provides a perfect platform to discuss ways to break down the structural barriers faced by women, particularly those from marginalized communities, such as women with disabilities, and to develop supportive policies, practices, and incentives founded on human rights principles. So, Moderator, let me conclude by reinforcing that the region is indeed committed to ensuring the full inclusivity, equity, and equality for all people by defending and promoting human rights, gender equality, and social inclusion to ensure that no one is left behind. And this is what the 2050 strategy aims to deliver on. So may I leave us all with a quote from the Danish Institute of Human Rights. And I quote, "This is not a time to neglect human rights. It is a time when, more than ever, human rights are needed to navigate this crisis in a way that will allow us, as soon as possible, to focus again on achieving equitable, sustainable development and sustaining peace." So with these remarks, I thank you again for the opportunity to speak. Vinaka Vakalevu, and I look forward to the discussions at this forum. I thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion, especially about the institutional structural issues that you have raised. Thank you to the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the Resident Coordinator of the United Nations for Micronesia, Mr. Jaap van Heerden, who has devoted about 30 years to development, peace building, and humanitarian assistance. He worked initially with the United Nations system from 1991 to 2016, and notably with the UN Office for Project Services in a wide range of country, regional, and corporate level managerial and leadership positions, spanning a number of continents, most notably in Asia, as Deputy Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, and also as the Country Director and Representative for Cambodia and the Philippines. Then, over the past few years, he headed the International NGO Coordate in Afghanistan. And Mr. van Heerden has just taken up his position as the first UN resident coordinator in Micronesia on the 1st of October. This is a new position, as the UN Multi-Country Office for Micronesia was created just recently in the context of the UN Development System reform, covering the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Nauru, and Palau. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Jaap van Heerden.
Thank you so much, Heike. Thank you, everyone, for this, for being here for this extremely important second UN Pacific Business and Human Rights Forum. I'm extremely pleased and honored to be one of the speakers. Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, distinguished delegates, good morning from Pohnpei. It is a great honor that I address you as the new resident coordinator from Micronesia. The Office for Micronesia was initiated in October this year and demonstrates the commitment of the United Nations and its member states to the Micronesian countries. Notably, the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, Palau, Nauru, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, ensuring that we leave no one behind. My office will contribute to strengthen the UN support to the realization of UN principles, human rights, gender equality, and sustainability across the region. Ladies and gentlemen, this year, we have seen in various international fora, such as the Human Rights Council, the Global Food System Summit in September, and the just concluded COP26 negotiations, that the climate crisis represents the most significant threat to human rights worldwide, and particularly for the Pacific nations. We have also seen a global movement for more to be done, whether it is the realization of the right to a healthy and sustainable development environment, or the creation of the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change. People are asking for more accountability and more protection of their rights and the environment. We all, including the business community, have a role to play. Therefore, this forum could not be timelier. Small island development states have been among the most active and vocal in these global dialogues that have focused on the very foundations of survival of the people of this region. Realizing human rights is at the heart of this discourse. The rights of the people of the Pacific are intrinsically linked to the social, economic, and ecological balance of the region, as the Pacific people's culture, tradition, and livelihoods are interlinked with the natural world. This forum acknowledges the importance of the role of business, both national and international, in the human rights narrative, and seeks to support the sector to leverage its role as an agent of transformative positive change in the Pacific. The Pacific region faces a unique complexity of human rights challenges in which businesses play a critical role. They can not only protect human rights, but also lend their hands to strategic global objectives, such as the 2030 Agenda, which build upon common principles and values, shared goals based on a shared vision placing people and the planet at the center, calls upon us to ensure an all-of-society approach, from government to the private sector to civil society at local, national, regional, and global levels, to work in partnership to ensure that no region, no country, no individual is left behind, as we aim to ensure a peaceful, secure, and better future for all. The 2030 Agenda reminds us that in order for this to be achieved, we do truly need to act all for one and one for all, or we will fail. Business and the private sector have the ability to be a pivotal development partner in the realization of sustainable development goals. If these are to be achieved, it is essential that the business community fully assumes its responsibilities regarding climate change, COVID-19 recovery, and human rights. The business sector is such a crucial actor due to the nature of the foundations upon which the region's economies are based, such as leveraging of natural resources, international fishing industry and extractive industries, including land and deep sea mining, and tourism. When considering the additional stress factors arising from the region's physical and socio-political geography, a unique pattern of challenges emerges. Human trafficking, illegal and unregulated labor migration, exploitation of migrant workers and modern-day slavery, destruction of marine resources, including fish stocks and coral, sexual exploitation and abuse, child exploitation, the impact of climate change, and the mental health issues related to climate anxiety are just some of the challenges, compounding each other with devastating effects. Left unchecked, the results on the social and cultural fabric of the region, as well as the sustainability of the economy, threaten to destroy the habitat upon which the very survival of the people depend, limiting progress towards sustainable development goals globally. To support business actors to realize this ambition, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also referred to as UNGPs, were developed to provide the authoritative global framework to prevent and address negative human rights impacts related to business, which include business-related human rights impacts on climate change. The UNGPs reflect core elements of international human rights law. Any legal or policy responses to the human rights implications of climate change that involve business should be aligned with the UNGPs, as well as with relevant international standards and their current interpretation. In the Pacific region, in particular, having to face the realities of the climate emergency and the socio-economic impact of COVID-19, concrete action is required. It is now that we must focus on building back better, or even simply building up better. National action plans on business and human rights across the Pacific region should be a pivotal instrument supporting the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, supporting governments to mitigate negative human rights impacts of business, while garnering their transformative power to promote human rights, human security and rights. Why are we highlighting the importance of guiding principles on business and human rights and the national action plans for the Pacific? Is it not a global initiative to address a global issue? I would argue that the Pacific is facing a unique combination of issues, which the global community must support the region in addressing with. A unique sense of urgency. It is not an exaggeration to say that the small island development states, in particular, but not exclusively, the small atoll nations are facing a crisis of near epic proportions. There is still time to act now, but act now we must. It is this sense of urgency, even state of emergency in the Pacific, which makes it imperative to urgently strengthen the focus on business and human rights in the Pacific. Distinguished colleagues, we must acknowledge that some progress has been made in recent years, but it is too slow and disparate, both in the business sector itself, as well as in terms of the regulatory environment. Despite the growth in digital traceability and platforms promoting transparency, supply chains remain largely opaque. Less than a fifth of the companies confirmed full supply chain mapping and scrutiny. Some positive developments are evident in the Pacific. The Council of Regional Organizations of the Pacific has developed and agreed upon a 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. Australia enacted the Modern Slavery Act, which requires large Australian companies to report on the risk of slavery in their operations and supply chains, as well as steps taken to respond to the identified risks. Example, human rights due diligence and remediation processes. Multiple capacity development initiatives promoting sustainable and inclusive economic opportunities and growth at the local level, such as the UN Women and UNDP projects in the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, amongst others, have been launched. Circling back to the 2030 agenda, specifically SDG 17 focuses on partnerships for development. The commitment of all actors at all levels, including regional organizations and global economic entities, is required if rights for all is to be achieved. The business and human rights nexus has long been a challenge in the realm of multinational companies and international investments, and it will continue to be an uphill battle. Nonetheless, the 2021 UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 10 years on stock-taking report does indicate that while there is a long way ahead, the principles and the national action plans are enabling positive change and providing states and businesses with effective tools to mitigate the negative impact of business on human rights and forge constructive global business and public-private partnerships that promote human rights and push forward to the attainment of sustainable development goals. As a representative of the Secretary General, it is my duty and my honor to advocate for the actioning of the UN principles, values, and norms. It is the role of the United Nations, as determined by its member states, to work in a collaborative manner with business partners to seek positive action. We call upon the business community and states to adopt and comply with the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and for governments to implement policies and plans that seek to encourage human rights due diligence through the development and implementation of legislation, policies, and national action plans. Through this positive and comprehensive approach, Pacific states can harness the power of businesses and use this force to contribute to the realization of the 2030 agenda, the goal of 1.5 degrees, and advance human rights for all. I thank you all for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaap van Heerden, the first resident coordinator in Micronesia. And thank you for the action points that you have given us and the very important reminder of how the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals, is connected to human rights and to the business and human rights agenda. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Kameli Bhattiwetti, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation. Mr. Batiweti is originally from Vanuatu and has over 25 years of experience in human capital management and corporate services management. He's held senior executive positions in the tourism, manufacturing, and agricultural sectors in Fiji. And he was also one of the founding members of the Fiji Human Resources Institute, and has taken over the presidency of the Institute in October 2016. So it is my pleasure to give you the floor, Mr. Bhattiwetti.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. And Bula Vinaka, everyone. It's a great pleasure of mine to take this opportunity to speak at this very important forum. I speak on behalf of the business community in Fiji. And so I'll start off with our interpretation of business and human rights, which is the field in dealing with human rights responsibilities of business enterprises. The key elements are they are not entities merely meant to maximize profit for stakeholders. Rather, there is also responsibilities and respect that comes with making a profit. Businesses, in our view, have human rights responsibilities that are independent of what the state requires. And so there ought to be policies and good governance which will ensure that these responsibilities are upheld at all times. Human rights should be internalized by businesses, and any breach is addressed in a timely manner, and yet maintaining and respecting the confidentiality of the victims. States, governments must ensure that corporations, companies respect human rights and that laws are written up to support these human rights. Corporate accountability is a must, and victims must always have access to remedy. So what is Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation, the company I represent? It's a national private sector organization under the umbrella of the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization, or PIPSO, and also represents the employers in Fiji in the tripartite body of the ILO. So Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation has 10 standing councils at present, and each of the council has its own chairperson, and membership of each of the council consists of members' representatives whose interests are in the specific work that the councils undertake, and they all form part of this council. So the councils are, we have a retailers council, we have a mining and quarrying council, we have a professional and financial services council, we have a human resources council, we have a manufacturers council, we have a tourism and transport council, we have a women entrepreneurs and business council, we have a youth entrepreneurs council, we have a business disaster resilience council, and also the latest council that we have just formed is the Business Process Outsourcing Council, soon to be renamed as Outsourcing. So Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation is 61 years old this year, in September this year. and has approximately 380 members and affiliates ranging in size from micro, small, medium, and large enterprises. And it also includes some of the local government urban authorities and also statutory bodies, and represents approximately 80,000 employees in Fiji. And so it covers, its membership covers a full range of private enterprise endeavors, as well as some of the public sector activities that are entrusted to statutory undertakings or government-owned corporation. Our position, Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation, is unique that we don't represent just one particular sector. We represent a far-ranging sector from airlines to warehouses and everything else in between, unlike other employer organizations that tend to be involved in the specific sectoral interest or activity of their members. One of the key focus that the other speakers who have spoken before me mentioned, our key focus of the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation since 2020 and onwards is addressing modern slavery, which is the exploitation of workers, and also the eradication of worst forms of child labor. So what is modern slavery? It's a serious violation of an individual's dignity and human rights. It involves criminal practices, including human trafficking, slavery, servitude, which is bondage, forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and the worst forms of child labor. These are all considered modern slavery, which is the exploitation of people who have been forced, deceived, or coerced into a life of labor and servitude for personal or commercial gain by individuals or companies. It is a crime that's hidden from society, where victims are subjected to abuse, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Labor exploitation involves subjecting workers to excessive hours without proper remuneration as required by employment law and occupational health and safety regulation. So does modern slavery exist in Fiji? It is said that it does exist in Fiji. And so there is evidence of modern slavery in Fiji with the exploitation of women and children in the sex trade, as well as in the fishing industry, as articulated in a report that's called Murky Waters that was done by the Walk Free Foundation in Australia. Labor exploitation is also practiced, as seen in some sectors, with workers subjected to excessive hours of work without the proper remuneration, including non-payment of overtime, non-payment of allowances, and also the mandatory safety practices. The majority of these workers, they come from marginalized communities and are unlikely to speak up out of fear of losing their employment. So what does businesses in Fiji and the Pacific Islands, what do they need to do? And so certain companies in Fiji are already working towards eradicating modern slavery and exploitation out of their supply chain. And they are partnering with only compliant suppliers. So suppliers that are compliant with modern slavery requirements or the eradication of modern slavery requirements are the only ones who will be engaged by these companies to do work and to do business with them. So some of these companies, if I may provide some recognition for them, that have adopted anti-modern slavery and anti-worker exploitation practices in Fiji. They include the ANZ Bank, they include Asset Australia, that recently was called Asaleo Care, Coca-Cola Fiji Limited, and Coca-Cola of all the parts of the region also, Nestle, Unilever, the Total business of supplying fuel and oil, and also Wormald Fire and Security/Guard Force. This is just to name a few, and the source is Modern Slavery Registry. So why is it important for the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation and its partners to act now? So the speakers before me mentioned that modern slavery is now legislated in Australia since 2018. And so most certainly that legislation will be replicated across the Pacific Islands. And so it's incumbent on organizations like Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation to, number one, create awareness. Number two, create the framework within which the organizations that form the membership of Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation can use to help them to transition into complying with the anti-modern slavery requirements. And so our initial objective as Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation is to raise awareness. So we've started awareness programs with our different councils on what modern slavery is and what labor exploitation entails, in partnership with the Ministry of Employment, Productivity and Industrial Relations in Fiji, also the International Labour Organization. And once we are done, we are going to offer our services to PIPSO to help them to replicate it across the region in the Pacific Islands. Once we are done with our members, we hope to take it out to other organizations who are not members of FCEF. So recently, we presented as a panelist in a UN forum on business and human rights that was in Suva, where it covered modern slavery and worker exploitation in Fiji. And so more needs to be done in bringing to light cases of exploitation in Fiji's workforce so that organizations realize the severity of modern slavery and exploitation in the workforce and how it affects the society in general. And so this is linked to social issues such as the neglect of families, because the parent in the home now has to work long hours. There is an increase in mental issues in the Pacific Islands, and that results in domestic violence as a start, and it leads to more crime, etc., etc. And so in our effort to assist in promoting business and human rights, we speak to our members and to enterprises to cover all human rights, which are organized around the three pillars, which is protect, respect, and remedy. Let me repeat that. The three pillars are protect, respect, and remedy. We also work with government to in their duty to protect human rights. And also we speak to our members on their responsibility to put in place policies to respect human rights and to also implement effective remedy for the victims. We educate those in the mining industry on how they can minimize the effect of climate change and the effects of what it has on the people and environment. We promote environmentally friendly products amongst our members, And we are grateful that our members have responded accordingly. And under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, states have a duty to protect, and businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. And both have a role to effectively provide access to effective remedies. And Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation is working towards ensuring its members are aware of its responsibility. In closing, we ensure members of our organization implement responsible business conduct standards as business and human rights issues are becoming a global priority. So as businesses aim to do good while doing no harm, implementing responsible business conduct standards sets out an expectation that all businesses, regardless of their legal status, their size, their ownership, or their sector, they ought to avoid and address negative impacts of their operations while contributing to sustainable development in the countries where they operate, or in our country and in the areas that they operate. In closing, a key element of responsible business conduct is a risk-based due diligence, a process through which businesses can identify, prevent, and mitigate their actual and potential negative impacts and account for how these impacts are addressed. This process involves meaningful consultation with potentially affected groups and other relevant stakeholders. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Vinaka.
Vinaka, and thank you, Mr. Batiweti, from the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation. Very important points that you made there about the standards and how the business community can uphold them. And we would now like to come to our last speaker for the opening session, who is Ms. Emeline Ilolahia, who is the Executive Director of the Pacific Islands Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, or PIANGO in short. She has over a decade of experience and a strong track record in promoting sustainable growth and social development in the Pacific region, both at regional level and national level. And she is a very strong partner within the civil society, but also a strong partner to us in the United Nations and to other development partners. She was previously the executive director of the Civil Society Forum of Tonga, and there she was instrumental in bringing together and supporting coalitions, working on a number of different areas, such as ethical leadership or women for access to finance and leadership, and including issues such as political participation as well as deep sea mining. She was inaugurally awarded the Jose Edgardo Campos Collaborative Leadership Award in Washington in 2016 in recognition of her contributions to local leadership in Tonga. Ciale, it is my pleasure to see you at the second forum after we first met at the first one, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heike. Ko le peke u whanga he whakatapu, kai ata ke te au ke u kawatu he talanoa o e pongpongini, acknowledging the Deputy SG of PIFS, Philemon Manoni, as well as our fellow speakers, Mr. Kameli, my counterpart in business and human rights, talking about businesses and the practices that they had in Fiji is inspiring to hear how we see the work that we have been involved in promoting public awareness on business and human rights in partnership with the diplomacy training program. as well as the CCF, and is also need to acknowledge the full support of Heike and the Office of the Human Rights in the Pacific in Fiji. I think a lot of things has been said by the speakers before me, but I just want to bring a few points to be part of the conversation, because I'm quite inspired to see the many sessions that are following today and tomorrow that are really speaks to the core of the business and human rights principles that we talk a lot about, and a lot of that are also part of the training that are carried out, particularly for our human rights defenders in the Pacific. If we are to reflect on what's exactly PIANGO's role in the business and human rights space, is because a lot of the work that we do is to make sure that our citizens and our people are part and parcel of deciding and making decisions around the sustainable development that need to be providing social services to the community in terms of their well-being and their livelihood. And so if we could reflect on where the development context of our world now, we have come to recognize a couple of key points that are really related to how we see business and human rights feature. One is the deepening of the global inequality, and the COVID-19 make that even deeper. The worsening of the climate crisis, we had that already being discussed by the previous speakers. The escalating conflict and humanitarian threats, that's common across the globe, including our Pacific. Expanding of corporate capture of development, and I think this is crucial to the challenges that we are facing in our region, particularly when we see the impact of the corporate capture with corporate companies within the extracting industry. The shrinking and closing civic space that has also been mentioned, but also at the same time, we have to recognize the off-track of aid and development cooperation reform in our region, and more so when we are talking about building back better. And this brings us to, reflecting on the responsibility of the state and business in terms of making sure that the UN human business and human rights principles protect, respect, and remedy, being part and parcels of where do we want to see the progress in terms of promoting human rights in our region. There are also, perhaps I'll talk quickly about the journey that PIANGO has taken with our partners in the business and human rights training, convened by the diplomacy training program, CCF and PIANGO, as well as the Office of the High Commission to Business and Human Rights in the Pacific, have helped run some of this training, particularly for human rights defenders, to share their experiences and to really understand the different instruments within the UN system that they can use to demand accountability from businesses practices that are not helping or demand the human rights, particularly women in mining industry, logging, and extracting industry. And so what we have seen as a good practice, that the training has been done. So we identify the mechanisms of reporting back to the UN, such as the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review that BNG was reporting this year. So we ran the training before that has allowed the human rights defenders to to perhaps use the training to inform them, and then use the mechanisms of the reporting to the UN as a platform where can they put into practice what they've learned, but at the same time contextualize the training so that they can make sense of their own context and use that to make their submissions. And it has, if I'm correct, I think that we had more than 20 individual participants from PNG. Most of them are actually on call now, joining these sessions. But I think that why I'm sharing that, because it's bring to light that the things that we need to focus in as civil society is really the question of the how. Yeah, we have a lot of information available about the UN human rights principles, but really, how do we use that to make sure that, as the previous speakers, that we are not just talking about policies and papers, commitments and declarations, but the practices of that need to happen. And most of the time, if the government is making those policies in place, businesses are making different procedures and policies in place, we need as civil society players to test it out, see how we are making sure that that those policies are translated into practices. And we also would like to bring in the whole idea of aid, the whole idea of resources, that it need to be invested in civil society, so they are allowed to test the system, to make sure that they are in place, mechanisms are in place for them to test. I'll give an example also of the UBR report across our region, across our Pacific. You will find that year in, year out, there's always the recommendations made by civil society reporting to look into the national action plan. The national human rights institutions has always come out in their reporting. So how do we make sure that those recommendations are being actioned upon? And so what we have seen as well is recognizing that sometimes we have declarations with good intention, but if there are no resources put in place, and so civil society now, we are working in 7 of our countries in the Pacific, trying to track where are the budget in our national budget that are reflected, that there is allocations allocated to make sure that those human rights mechanisms are in place. And apparently we're seeing that there is hardly any resources put aside to make sure that the country have set up their national human rights institutions, let alone the initiative to come up with the national action plan. And so this is where I think that perhaps the UN Office of the Human Rights might want to consider putting resources into civil society to start working with their government in demanding to have those institutions in place. The other one that I want to highlight is the capacity of our civil society and our human rights defenders, which is something that is being recognized. And the last one that I would like to finish off with is the strengthening of access to remedy. And I'm saying this with what we have learned from our training, is that we may know how, we may know where to access, we may know how to hold some of these things to account. But if there are no support in terms of legal aid, or there is no support of systems, so that our people that are victims of irresponsible practices of businesses can access those resources and those services, then there is something that we need to look into. My final point is that consultations. Consultations of our people is crucial to make sure that we are looking at business and human rights more from a broader development lens. And we have seen a lot of particularly in our extracting industry, our indigenous people are affected, particularly our women. So we have to continue to call upon our government to make sure that good, constructive mechanisms are put in place to ensure that a formal consultation is done so that people are informed with the principle of FPIC to make sure that they're participating in making those decisions. I'll leave it there, and I hope that the participants will continue to learn from the different various sessions that are following, and I'm sure they will continue to unpack some of the things that we have discussed now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Executive Director of PIANGO. You've touched upon a number of really important issues, most notably the question of accountability, the question of resources, the question of capacity, and certainly resources and capacity for those who are monitoring and holding states and other stakeholders, including businesses, to account. So thank you for those important reminders at the very end of our opening session here. It is unfortunately not going to be possible to have much of a discussion because we are due to go into the next session here, but it remains for me to thank all of our introductory speakers, the keynote speakers, and to hope that we will be having very important and useful discussions here in the next 2 days. I would also like to thank again, a number of the UN agencies who are included in the forum and who are some of whom are leading some of those sessions. Those are the UN Environmental Programme, UN Women, the International Labour Organization, UN Development Programme, and the UN Capital Development Fund. So with thanks to those colleagues from those organizations, as well as, of course, all of those who are also going to be leading the sessions from civil society, from the business community, from government and academia, of whom we have quite a few representatives here as well. So with that, I thank everyone, Bulavinaka, and give the floor back to our MC for the day, for this session here in the morning, Robert Vaughan, who is the focal point for business and human rights, as well as for climate change in our Pacific Regional Office. Robert, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Heike, and thank you very much for all the keynote speakers for their insightful remarks.